Hi, my name's Paul Merrison and welcome to paper P1, The Professional Accountant. This exam paper is relatively new to the ACCA. There are no old exam papers that became P1. It has only existed since the December 2007 syllabus. That gives us a little bit of a challenge in that there are not that many past exam questions available for us to attempt. But the good news is that although we have a fairly small number of past exam questions, we are already starting to see some patterns emerge, and already the same questions have been asked more than once. So the really good news for this exam is that if you get it, if you understand why the paper exists and where the examiner is coming from, it really should not be that difficult to pass it. Now, what do we mean by professional accountant? Well, being professional is about how you behave. And this exam is really all about behaviour. And we can split the syllabus fairly easily into two chunks. On the one hand, we have the behaviour of companies. And companies, of course, are run by directors. And whilst not all directors are qualified accountants, many of them would be, and that's how it sort of ties into qualifying to be an accountant. So we need to look at how company directors behave, and maybe more importantly, how they should behave. It's not just about directors, though. Companies are owned by shareholders. And whilst in many countries they tend to leave running the companies to directors, how shareholders behave could also prove to be important. In a wider sense, though, this is not just about how people behave when they're running companies. As accountants, all aspects of our behaviour need to be considered, and therefore the second big chunk of this course looks at ethics in a more general sense. Behaviour. How should we behave as professionals? Because this exam is about behaviour, it makes it a very real-world, practical exam. We will, of course, take a look at plenty of theories. Corporate governance itself is largely theoretical, but of course we have to then apply it to real company and organisational situations. In the ethics part of the course, we will also look at some theories. Is there one set of accepted behaviour, for example, or could accepted behaviour be different in different countries, different cultures, at different time periods, in different situations? But once we've looked at those theories, the key is making sure we can understand them well enough to apply them to real situations. And by real, I mean real. We have already seen on this exam the examiner using clear references to real companies, albeit with the names changed, to create his questions. What that means is that it's very important that as we go through this course, we try to apply what we learn to what we see in the world around us. And throughout these videos, you're going to see me mentioning a number of real companies, both from current situations and recent past situations, to help us understand what this course is about. But don't just rely on me. You need to read the newspapers. Not all of them, but you should read the business pages and look out for examples that relate to the course. For example, newspapers tend to report fairly heavily when major companies are changing their chairman or chief executive, the two most senior roles on a board of directors. The reasons why they're changing and how they are going about that process of change are both very relevant to this course. So whenever you see an article in the newspaper explaining that a company are making one of these changes at senior level, it's worth reading it and just trying to find out a bit more about what is going on. Anyway, I've mentioned the importance of the real world. Let's just have a little look at the structure of the exam, talk about the examiner, and talk about one or two things the examiner has said which I think are very important at this early stage of the course. Firstly, the exam. The P1 exam paper is made up of a 50-mark case study. Now, we shouldn't get too upset by the words case study. Some people look at those words and think, massive question, too much to read, not enough time. It won't be that bad. So far, the questions for the case studies have tended to be round about a page and a half of story, which is not that much in a 3-hour exam. We would expect those 50 marks to be divided up amongst 3, 4, 5 maybe, different sub-questions. And because of that, a very large amount of the syllabus can be tested in that single question. As we'll see shortly, this is not a very big syllabus. As such, we could see most of the syllabus appearing on every exam paper. This is the sort of exam where cherry-picking, trying to learn specific areas but ignoring others, is a very dangerous tactic. It's a small syllabus, you need to cover all of it. The other questions are 25 markers, and there'll be 3 of those, and you get to choose 2. As you might expect, the 25-mark questions will have smaller scenarios backing them up, and will probably only cover 1 or 2 areas of the syllabus. So far, our experience of this paper is that the case study question, which is compulsory, might have 1 or 2 bits in it that will challenge you, but when it comes to choosing the 25-mark questions, most students have said, if anything, their biggest problem has been that they could have done all 3 of them. The examiner. Let's have a little word about him. The examiner's name is David Campbell, and he's a university professor. And his university courses cover a lot of the areas on this syllabus, as you might expect. Now, bear in mind, when students go to university, they choose to do particular subjects. So he is used to having students in front of him who are very interested in the subjects on this syllabus. He is well aware that most students sitting this exam are sitting it not really because they have a deep interest in this particular syllabus, but because they want to become accountants. But despite that, he still expects you to try to build up some interest. He expects you to read the newspapers. He expects you to look at this in real-world scenarios. Now, when your tutor is teaching you this paper, when you're watching me do these videos, your tutor or I will, of course, try to give you some real-world insight. But there are stories happening on a daily basis that relate to this course, and we can't cover all of them. So you need to read yourself. Make sure you are trying to apply this stuff to the real-world stuff happening in the news. It is very important if you can. It will be a major benefit to you. A couple of things that David Campbell has said, which I think are very relevant and we need to understand. As I've already said, Mr. Campbell has said that this is a very small syllabus, and this concerned him. He said to me that it would be very difficult for him to vary the questions very much. And I said, good. Because we like it if the questions are fairly repetitive, because it means for every exam paper we've got plenty of old questions to practice. So small syllabus is good. The other interesting thing he said was that he thought teaching this exam to accountants might be rather difficult. Because the nature of accountancy students is that they want to learn accountancy, and the majority feel happier with numbers than they do with words. Bad news is, this is an entirely words subject. It is entirely written, there are no calculations to do. He also said that because his students at university have chosen to do this, he can talk to them about the real world, knowing they'll go off and read about it, web search it, read the newspapers, and do some research themselves. Whereas he is very concerned that accountancy exam students will expect their tutor to tell them everything and won't go and think about it outside the classroom. If you're not prepared to think about this stuff outside the classroom, it will hold you back. A little bit of thought and a little bit of application to the real world will go a long way on this exam. Now, of course, for any exam, there are some tips as to how to do well. And apart from reading around the subjects, there is one other tip, which I found very useful in dealing with all of the questions he's set so far. It's a tip that I've always said to students on every exam, but it seems to be particularly useful for this exam. And that is, you must spend some time breaking down the requirements before you read the stories. Sometimes stories can be very involved. The case study, of course, will be a page and a half long, but even in the smaller stories, some of the details you're given might confuse you. And if there's too much detail, brains tend to be focused on one particular thing you read, and you miss the big picture. So my top tip for this exam is when you start reading questions, ignore the story and focus on the requirements for a few minutes. Firstly, break those requirements down. What do I mean by break them down? Well, if a question says, explain this theory and apply it to this situation, that's two questions, isn't it? There'll be some marks for explaining the theory, probably not that many because it's just knowledge, and probably rather more marks for then taking that theory and applying it to the actual situation you've got. You can explain the theory without even reading the story, of course. Applying it will need the story to be read. But it should be possible to plan large parts of your answers before you even read the stories. There is no point reading the detailed stories until you fully understand the nature of the requirements. And when we start attempting the questions, you'll see that I spend quite a lot of time analysing what the question is asking before I even bother reading the stories. And it's important that you do that too. To a certain extent, the ACCA help you out here. We have 15 minutes of reading time at the start of the exam, when you cannot start writing your actual answers. My tip for that 15 minutes is very simple. Don't read any of the stories. Force yourself to spend 15 minutes just breaking down the requirements for all of the questions on the paper. Once you've done that in enough detail, it should be fairly easy to decide which of the three optional questions you're not going to do. But break down the requirements of all of them. You may find that once you start thinking about it, the question you thought you didn't want to do actually turns out to be the one you'd rather do. So use the reading time to analyse the requirements. Start planning what you think you might write. Think through the syllabus as to which areas seem to apply to the question. You can read the stories once the full 3-hour exam starts.